The courtroom buzzed with muted whispers, the air thick with tension. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras flashing as they whispered among themselves, already scripting their headlines. The billionaire's son walks free, justice for the dead, father denied. Nathan Caldwell sat at the defense table, arms crossed, smirking like this was nothing more than an inconvenience, a speed bump on his golden road of life. His $1,000 suit was crisp, his designer watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his arrogance filled the room like a stench. The judge read the sentence, his voice measured but firm. Nathan Caldwell, for the charge of vehicular manslaughter while under the influence, this court finds you guilty. However, due to mitigating circumstances and lack of prior offenses, your sentence will be 18 months probation, a suspended license, and a mandatory rehabilitation program. Gasps rippled through the room. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. In the second row, Lisa Carter, widow of the man Nathan killed, let out a strangled sob. Her lawyer squeezed her hand, whispering something, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The man who plowed his sports car into her husband at 90 miles per hour was walking away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Nathan? He laughed, a small, breathy chuckle as he shook his head, leaning toward his lawyer like the whole thing was a joke. The people around him were devastated, broken, barely holding it together. And he was laughing. James Holloway clenched his fists, his jaw locking so tight it felt like his teeth would crack. He hadn't planned to say anything. He had promised himself he would sit quietly, listen, and honor his best friend's memory. But watching that smug, spoiled bastard grin while his best friend's widow sobbed into her hands, that wasn't happening. The judge slammed his gavel. Court is adjourned. The moment the words left his mouth, Nathan stood up, stretching, grinning at his attorney. Easiest day of my life. James moved before he could think. In a second, he was on his feet, cutting across the aisle, stepping right into Nathan's path. The billionaire's son barely spared him a glance. Can I help you, old man? James didn't blink, didn't move, just stared into those entitled, spoiled eyes and let silence do the talking. Nathan scoffed, rolling his eyes. Jesus, what is this, some kind of intervention? He turned to his security guard. Get this guy out of my face. The guard, a muscle-bound goon in an expensive suit, stepped forward, but James, he didn't even acknowledge him. He spoke, his voice low, steady, and cold. The man you killed, Michael Carter, he was my brother. Nathan's smirk wavered, just for a second. Then it came back, thinner this time, more forced. And James took a slow step forward, closing the space between them until Nathan could feel the weight of his presence. You think this is over? James said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan froze. James had been in war zones. He had stared men in the eye moments before pulling the trigger. He had stood over dying enemies and watched the light leave their eyes. And he had never looked at a man with more contempt than he did now. Nathan sensed it, felt it deep in his chest, that primal instinct screaming that the man standing in front of him was something different. James leaned in just slightly. You laugh now, but one day you're going to look up from your comfortable little life, and you're going to see a man who doesn't care about your money, your father, or your name. A man who only cares about balance. Nathan swallowed, but the smirk stayed. What? Are you threatening me? James tilted his head. Do I need to? Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. Behind him, his father, Robert Caldwell, finally noticed what was happening. The billionaire stormed over, his presence as loud as the money in his bank account. Who the hell are you? Robert demanded, stepping between James and his son. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I suggest you back off. James didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him at all. He only had eyes for Nathan. You walk away from this today, James said, his voice still calm even. But one day someone won't let you. Nathan exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching slightly as he adjusted his tie. He laughed, short, nervous. Yeah, and who's gonna stop me? You? James finally smiled. It wasn't kind. You'll see, he murmured. Then he turned, walked past the grieving widow, still wiping tears from her face, past the reporters, past the people who had come looking for justice, and left with disappointment. He pushed open the doors and stepped into the cold air. Behind him, Nathan let out a breath, shaking his head. Guy's insane. But the moment James was gone, he exhaled again, a little too fast, a little too shaky. His father put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing tight. Ignore him, he's nothing. Nathan nodded. Yeah, nothing. Then why, as they walked toward their luxury car, did his hands still feel cold? Why did his chest still feel tight? And why, for the first time in his entire privileged life, did he feel afraid? Nathan Caldwell sat in the back seat of his father's luxury sedan, his phone in his hand, scrolling mindlessly. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, reflecting back his own face, smug, untouchable, invincible. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But his fingers were tapping against the phone screen, a nervous tic he didn't even realize he had. His father sat beside him, silent, his expression cold and unreadable. Robert Caldwell wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. "You handled that poorly," Robert said finally, not bothering to look up from the glass of whiskey he swirled in his hand. Nathan scoffed, forcing a smirk. Handled what? That man. The soldier. Nathan rolled his eyes, leaning back against the leather seat. Please, just some washed-up veteran looking for attention. What? Am I supposed to be scared? His father exhaled through his nose, setting his drink down on the console between them. No, Nathan, but you should be careful. Nathan's smirk faltered. Robert Caldwell turned his head slowly, his sharp, calculating gaze pinning Nathan in place. Men like him don't make empty threats. You think because we live in a world of lawyers and settlements that you're untouchable. He leaned in slightly. You're not? Nathan bristled, his pride clawing at his chest. You're seriously giving me a lecture because some old war junkie got in my face? What's he gonna do? Write me a strongly worded letter? His father sighed and looked away, as if already losing patience with him. You don't get it, and that's your problem. Nathan clenched his jaw, looking back at his phone, scrolling through messages, people texting him, laughing about how ridiculous the trial was, about how he got away with it. He should have felt good. He should have been celebrating, but all he could hear was that voice. You don't know what you just walked away from. His fingers tightened around the phone. What the hell did that even mean? He shook it off. The car rolled to a stop in front of their penthouse building, and Nathan stepped out like he owned the city. Cameras flashed from the sidewalk, reporters waiting, eager for a comment. He smirked, adjusting his tie, flashing his best, I don't give a damn grin. See you in 18 months, he joked, winking at a camera before walking inside. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent. His father had already made a call before they even reached their suite, some high-level security firm. Nathan wasn't listening. He was already pouring himself a drink, brushing it all off. James Holloway was nothing, just some bitter old man trying to scare him. But later that night, when the city had gone quiet, when the alcohol had settled in his bloodstream and he was alone in his penthouse, Nathan found himself staring out at the skyline. Something felt wrong. His stomach was tight, his pulse uneven. Then his phone buzzed. He picked it up lazily, expecting another message from his friends. Instead, it was an unknown number. He frowned, thumb hovering over the screen. Something in his gut told him not to answer, but his pride won. He swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. Yeah? Silence. Then a low, steady voice. Are you feeling lucky yet? Nathan froze. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't screaming, threatening, shouting. It was calm, controlled, certain. Nathan swallowed. Who the hell is this? The line went dead. A chill crawled up his spine, and for the first time since he walked out of that courtroom, he felt it. Not irritation, not arrogance, fear. Nathan's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. His heartbeat hammered in his chest, loud enough that he swore he could hear it echo through the empty penthouse. The city lights sprawled beneath him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but for the first time in his life, he felt small. He turned, scanning the room, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Are you feeling lucky yet? The words replayed in his head, wrapping around his mind like a noose. His first instinct was to laugh it off, just like everything else. Just some nut job trying to spook him. Maybe some loser from the trial, one of those nobodies who actually thought the law worked the way it was supposed to. Except it wasn't. That voice. It wasn't someone throwing threats. It wasn't someone posturing, puffing up their chest like a wannabe tough guy. It was something worse. It was a man who had already made up his mind. Nathan exhaled, forcing himself to move, to shake it off. He walked to the liquor cabinet, his bare feet silent against the marble floors. His hands were still shaking as he poured himself a drink, spilling a few drops on the counter. "Jesus, get a grip," he muttered. He took a deep sip, letting the burn settle in his chest. It's nothing, just some washed-up soldier trying to rattle him. And yet, his eyes flicked back to his phone. His father had already ramped up security after the trial, just in case. There were 2 armed guards stationed at the elevator downstairs, another patrolling the private rooftop entrance. No one was getting in. No one was coming for him. He told himself that, again and again. But sleep didn't come easy. And when it did, it came with shadows. The dream started as something familiar, his usual post-party chaos, music blaring, women on either side of him, his friends cheering, money flowing like water. Then, it shifted. The music faded. The laughter died. The penthouse lights dimmed until all he could see was a single figure sitting across from him, James Holloway. He wasn't speaking, wasn't moving, just staring. Nathan's chest tightened. He tried to stand, but his body felt glued to the chair. James leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. His voice was calm, too calm. "You ever wonder what it feels like?" Nathan's throat dried. "What?" "To beg for your life and know it won't make a difference." Nathan jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering. A dream. Just a dream. His phone buzzed. He flinched. The screen lit up with another unknown number. He hesitated, staring at it. The ringing filled the room, stretching, clawing at his nerves. Finally, he picked up, his voice coming out hoarse. "Listen, you crazy old bastard. I know you're awake." Nathan's blood turned to ice. He stood up too fast, knocking his glass over. It shattered, the sound sharp against the silence. His breathing shallowed, his hand gripping the phone so tight it hurt. "You don't scare me," he forced out, his voice lacking the weight it usually carried. "Good," James said. "Then this will be easy." The call cut out. Nathan stood there, frozen. Then, a knock at the door. Not the elevator, the penthouse door, the private entrance, the one that shouldn't have been accessible. Nathan backed away, his pulse spiking, his mind scrambling for logic. The guards, the cameras, no one could have gotten in. The knock came again, firm, deliberate. Nathan's breathing was ragged now. He took another step back, heart pounding in his ears. He grabbed his phone, pulled up his security system app. The cameras loaded. The hallway was empty. His stomach twisted into a knot. The knock came a third time. Nathan backed up so fast he nearly tripped over the glass shards at his feet. He grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a decorative knife from the shelf, something he had never actually needed before. The silence stretched. Then a voice, low and calm, just like before. "Now you understand?" Nathan whirled around. Nothing. The room was empty. The door was locked. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the knife so tight his knuckles went white. He was losing it. He had to be. Nathan Caldwell had been untouchable his whole life. No one, not the law, not the press, not even the families he had destroyed, had ever come close to shaking him. But James Holloway wasn't like the others. And now, Nathan wasn't sure if he was safe anymore. For the first time in his life, he was starting to realize this wasn't a game. And James, he wasn't bluffing. Nathan couldn't breathe. His hands were clammy, his grip on the knife slipping with sweat. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the silence that had settled over the penthouse like a thick, suffocating fog. He turned in slow, panicked circles, scanning every inch of the room, expecting to see James standing there. But there was nothing. The door was locked, the security system was armed, the cameras showed nothing, and yet he had heard it. The knock, the voice, the presence. His fingers fumbled across his phone, scrambling to dial security. The call rang once before a voice answered. "Sir?" Nathan's throat was dry. Someone's outside my door. Get up here, now. There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence that made Nathan's skin crawl. Then the guard's voice came back, quieter. Sir, we're standing outside your door. There's no one here. Nathan's stomach twisted. Check the damn cameras. We just did. Another pause. There's nothing, sir. Nathan's grip tightened on the phone, his breath coming faster, too fast. He was spiraling. Then how the hell did I hear knocking? The guards didn't answer right away, and he knew they were probably exchanging looks, wondering if their boss was cracking under pressure. Nathan swallowed hard, his tongue thick in his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut, took a slow, shaky breath, and forced himself to sound composed. Just stay on the floor. Lock the elevators. If anyone tries to get in, you put them down. Got it? Yes, sir. The line went dead. Nathan tossed the phone onto the counter and ran a shaking hand through his hair. His skin felt hot, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. James Holloway was in his head. That was it. That was all this was. The old bastard had gotten under his skin, made him paranoid, and he was letting him win. Nathan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, weak. He dropped the knife onto the counter, shaking his head. Jesus, I need some sleep. A drink first. Something strong, something that would burn the unease out of his system. He turned toward the liquor cabinet, reaching for a bottle, and stopped cold. There, sitting on the counter beside the whiskey. A single spent brass bullet casing. Nathan's breath hitched, his body locked up, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. That wasn't there before. It couldn't have been there before. Slowly, his fingers reached out, trembling as they hovered over the casing. It was smooth, polished, old but cared for, not fresh, not something from a random street thug. Nathan knew exactly what it was. A .308 sniper round, a round used by trained military marksmen. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. How the hell did it get here? His guards were outside. The penthouse was secured. No one had been inside. Had they? He swallowed, his throat tight, his pulse hammering. Slowly he picked up the casing, turning it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it. There was something etched into the brass. A date. He squinted. His heart skipped a beat. The date of the accident. The date he killed Michael Carter. Nathan stumbled back, his chair screeching against the floor. His vision blurred, the room tilting. He pressed a hand against the counter, trying to steady himself. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. His breath came fast and ragged, his hands trembling so bad he could barely hold onto the bullet. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. His phone. Another unknown number. Nathan hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't want to answer. He shouldn't answer. But his fingers moved before he could stop them, sliding across the screen. He pressed the phone to his ear, his lips dry, his voice barely above a whisper. Who are you? Silence. Then, that same low, steady voice. You're thinking about running, aren't you? Nathan's breath caught in his throat. You're wondering if you should get on a plane, disappear for a while, lay low, maybe even change your name, but you won't. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the edge of the counter. Because deep down, you know the truth. A pause, then just 2 words. Nowhere's safe. The line went dead. Nathan stood there, his entire body shaking. For the first time in his life, there was no escape. No money, no lawyers, no connections could save him from this. He had laughed in that courtroom. He had walked free thinking he had won. But now, standing in his multi-million-dollar penthouse, gripping a spent bullet in his trembling fingers, his heart racing like a trapped animal, Nathan Caldwell finally understood. He hadn't won anything. James Holloway had just started the game. The end.